Hey everybody, it's Tina-Desiree Berg. I am doing the live show this afternoon. Jordan is still working on his breaking piece. So I have a full show planned today with guest Robbie Martin. We're going to be discussing Biden's foreign policy and the corrupt think tanks that have influenced that foreign policy. Also, some of the appointments that he has made in departments of defense, Secretary of State, what have you. So all been influenced on that. But at the top of the hour, I want to talk about something that's going on with the stimulus. So when Biden was on the campaign trail in Georgia, he promised 2K stimulus without equivocation. There wasn't any bit about we're going to give you $1,400 to make the difference of the $600 you already got. It was unequivocally, we're going to give you 2K. So I'm going to play one of his campaign speeches in which he says this.
Send John and the Reverend to Washington, those $2,000 checks will go out the door, restoring hope and decency and honor for so many people who are struggling right now. And if you send Senators Perdue and Loeffler back to Washington, those checks will never get there. It's just that simple. The power is literally in your hands. By electing John and the Reverend, you can break the gridlock that has gripped Washington and this nation. With their votes in the Senate, we'll be able to make the progress we need to make on jobs, on health care, on justice, on the environment, on so many important things. By electing John and the Reverend, you'll be voting to get the states the resources they need to get the vaccines distributed. It's a shame what's happening now. It's a literal shame. I've said it before, getting America vaccinated will be one of the most difficult operational challenges this nation has ever faced. But we've known it for the last months. This administration has gotten off to a god-awful start. The president spends more time whining and complaining than doing something about the problem. I don't know why he still wants the job. He doesn't want to do the work.
This is just an unbelievable bait and switch. We now have the Democrats, the DNC, coming out and saying, hey, we didn't mean 2K. We meant we're going to send $1,400 to make up the difference with the $600K. This is an absolute disaster of a PR situation as far as I'm concerned. They campaigned on delivering a 2K check. It was that straightforward. They said it repeatedly, not just once or twice. And I feel that this is another example of the Democrats not being a strong opposition party or not coming in strong with things that they promised. And this could backfire for them. Another example would be the filibuster situation where you've now had Sinema or the gal from, what's her name? I forget her name. And Joe Manchin, the two of them are saying that they're going to side with the GOP on not banning the filibuster, so they need the 60 votes. So I think it's a problem. But to discuss this and some other things related to think tanks and foreign policy, I want to introduce Robbie Martin. Robbie's going to be joining me on the show today. Robbie is a journalist at Media Roots Radio. This is an area that he specializes in, so I wanted to have Robbie join me for this discussion. Welcome, Robbie.
Thanks for having me, Tina.
100%. So let's, right off the bat, what do you think about this Biden bait and switch on the 2K?
I mean, I can't say I'm that surprised by it whatsoever. But yeah, I mean, it's quite depressing. You know, the reality should be really sinking in for everybody at this point that the Democrats themselves do not care about supplementing Americans during this awful time. I mean, that should be very clear to everybody by now. It's not just the people in the Biden administration. It's pretty much the entire party, itself. So very depressing, but, at least it clarifies things, hopefully for some people who are still, putting their faith and hope into the Democratic Party.
Right. So what are Americans to do? Obviously, the GOP can't be trusted with this. And the Democrats, time and time again, just seem to be enabling the GOP because they're not a strong opposition. They try to make strong pledges about what they're going to do when they're running for office. Then they turn around and they water that down and they make agreements like the power sharing agreement that we're seeing now, with them. I think also we could talk about the IDC, which is the state New York Democratic Party had for a long time with the Republicans there. And it was used time and time again to stop progressive legislation. I think we're at a place, though, now where Americans and voters are kind of done with the empty promises. They're fed up. I mean, the civil unrest that we saw on January 6th from the far right, we see that, but we also see anger coming from the left side. So at some point, they're going to have to stop serving the plutonomy and start listening to voters. I don't know when that happens, though.
Yeah, I don't know when it happens either, because I mean, there aren't really that many forces, you know, pushing the envelope on this. I mean, there are some on the left, and, you know, there's been a lot of sort of infighting about that.
Yeah.
But there's not, you know, we need more of a mass movement. And yeah, we can't put any of our hopes into the actual administration. I think the only hope really at this point is to put more pressure on the representatives. But even like you said, I mean, things are just so polarized and divided right now. And some of the people who are in charge of the Democratic Party have been overtly trying to stop not just healthcare,
right,
but this as well. So it's going to require someone really loud, angry. You know, I don't have much faith in the squad, but in general, I think that's really what it's going to take. It's going to take someone very loud, who refuses to shut up, who gets press coverage and is demanding this and bringing it up every time they're on the floor. That to me, that's the only hope right now.
No, I hear you. So let's talk about think tanks. Think tanks in general, I think, are perceived as something other than what they are. Think tanks are a form of lobbying. So they're not academic institutions. I know that oftentimes people think that they're full of academics and they have studies in their name, right? So they must be academics, but they're not. They're a form of lobbying. Most of their funding comes from corporations or the military-industrial complex. Oftentimes their employees, their academics, put media pieces into publications like Politico has been caught doing this, where they have somebody from a think tank publishing a piece that's supposed to be news, but in actuality it's just propaganda for one of their corporate donors. I think back to my ex-boss, Ken Silverstein's expose that he did on CAP, Neera Tanden's organization, Center for American Progress, where she had basically this corporate rewards program. So when the corporations that gave more money, they would get more pieces placed, more lobbying done to congressional members on their behalf, all the way down the line. I think another one to look at is Molly McHugh from American Enterprise Institute. American Enterprise Institute is a neocon think tank that was responsible for being the biggest cheerleader for the Iraq War under the Bush administration. But it sort of never went away, and it became stronger again recently because it was involved very much in the Russia Gate kind of propaganda that was being put out during the last 4 years. So, you know, mainly they're looking to be really pro-war, for lack of a better way to put it, because they do represent big chunks of the military-industrial complex. So with further ado, I wanted to start off the hour talking about Tony Blinken. Now, he's the new Biden Secretary of State. He worked under the Obama administration as a national security advisor. He's also part of a wealthy family. His dad is a financier. He founded a consulting firm known as West Exec. This is a really nefarious organization because it's private equity money, military-industrial complex, mixed together with a think tank. And in fact, their slogan is, wait for it, bringing the situation room to the boardroom. So what are your thoughts on Tony? What research have you uncovered on this guy, and why should we be worried about him if we're in the anti-war movement?
Well, I think first we need to realize that the Secretary of State, you know, it's supposed to be some kind of diplomatic arm in the government. But in fact, what we've seen, you know, especially over the last 8 years, is that it's very linked into pushing hawkish foreign policy. And it's not as much diplomacy as it does seem to be into regime change, sort of backroom, sort of quasi-intelligence shenanigans and things like that. So Tony Blinken, I mean, his background is, you know, interesting in terms of the think tank circuit. One of the ones that he's associated with, that a lot of people have been associated with over the years, is the Council on Foreign Relations, which is sort of one of the most nefarious general foreign policy think tanks in DC. He's also was a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies,
Right.
which is also the CSIS. That's a sort of an obscure think tank that hasn't gotten that much publicity, but it's had a very large impact on the Biden and the Obama era foreign policy. And there's another thing too. So besides West Exec Advisors, he's also involved in something called Pine Island Capital Partners with Michelle Flournoy as well.
Yes.
Who was also one of his partners at West Exec. And it seems particularly dirty to me because, a lot of these think tank operators who, obviously they take defense contractor money through their think tanks and big corporations, pharmaceutical, a bunch of different kind of corporations. But this is something that I haven't personally seen before, where it's some kind of investment firm in that mixes together with defense companies. So that seems particularly dirty to me. But I guess it's not that entirely surprising, because it's the direction that all these things are sort of going in. It's just more brazen than what I've seen in the past.
It's very brazen. And you brought up Flournoy, who is a co-founder and ex-CEO of Center for New American Security, which is also another think tank that I want to talk about. But before we get into them, their major funding comes from defense contractors, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and also, wait for it, the U.S. government. They get actual direct funding from the U.S. government. I want to play for the audience, though, so that they're clear on what we're talking about, a piece of propaganda, because I don't know what else you call this. This is sort of supposed to be a video about who they are and how they introduce themselves to the world, but it's straight up propaganda. So let's go ahead and play that. This is Center for New American Security.
CNAS is where you come for bold policy recommendations that are also grounded in reality. There is a demand for ideas and for fresh thinking in the national security space, and that is what we are here to provide.
CNAS is shaping the national conversation on national security in a bipartisan manner.
Not just Republicans and Democrats working near each other, but actually working together.
We're always committed to having real-time policy impact.
Let's bring in Andrea at the National Intelligence Council. Joining me now,
Elon Goldenberg,
Senior Fellow at the Center for a New American Security.
2019 has been a pretty exceptional year for the organization.
One of the things I'm really proud of in 2019 is the engagement with policymakers, particularly those on Capitol Hill.
I'm grateful for this opportunity to be here today to speak to China's expanding influence in the Indo-Pacific.
One of the most important things that we'll be doing in this next year ahead of the 2020 election is the U.S.-China relationship. We think of that as the China challenge.
CNAS got chosen to write this congressionally mandated study of the Indo-Pacific because of the strength of our team.
CNAS works across a wide array of regions.
The Middle East,
nations like China,
Europe, defense,
and energy and technology.
We look at veterans issues through a national security lens.
One of my friends, who is a fellow veteran, told me that he went on our Veteran Benefit Finder and found out that he doesn't have to pay property tax, and it's going to save his family hundreds of dollars every single month.
We move quickly, and that means that we can follow the most important issue at hand.
But I also think about our work here as building intellectual capital for the future.
The CNAS is a very different kind of organization, and that it's 100% committed to giving young people a seat at the table.
The incredible talent that is here at CNAS are committed to the hard problems that face the country as we move into 2020 and beyond.
Because we are aimed at this ambitious but very valuable goal, creating a country and a world that is safer, more prosperous, and freer.
Okay, so now you folks can see what I'm talking about. Here you saw a video in which you had bipartisan support. So you had politicians from the Republican Party, politicians from the Democratic Party on the stage together, including Elizabeth Warren, who's supposed to be a progressive fighter. So Flournoy was on Biden's short list to be Secretary of Defense. She didn't get appointed. A guy named Lloyd Austin was appointed instead. He's with Raytheon on the board. But what have you uncovered about Flournoy? Because she seems to be somebody that floats between these think tanks. She's involved in the revolving door between working for the government and then going back out and working for the military-industrial complex. What's her story?
Well, she remained, I think, relatively obscure until maybe the middle part of the Obama administration. And that's when it became very clear that she was one of the biggest sort of envoys between the Obama administration and the think tank circuit. Now, around that same time, I'm talking about, I don't know, I want to say like late 2015 to 2014, she co-founded the CNAS. And the CNAS, one of the biggest deals about it is it seemed to be sort of this, they made a big show out of being not just bipartisan, but actually bringing together some of these Obama officials together with Bush era neocons specifically. And one of the main ones was Eric Edelman. And Eric Edelman was the U.S. ambassador to Turkey. He was one of Dick Cheney's key national security advisors. He helped cook up the false cherry-picked intelligence on Iraq. So that just in and of itself, the sort of the founding of the think tank, presenting it as this sort of union between the Obama and Bush era of foreign policy thinkers, was a sort of, I believe, sort of meant to be, to send a sign to the rest of DC that this is sort of okay now. This is sort of the new way. We're sort of moving forward on this sort of bringing, the neocons and the liberals together sort of thing. And we saw, of course, that manifest in the election when the neocons from the Bush era were advising Hillary Clinton. But Michelle Flournoy, I mean, she also has a history in the Council on Foreign Relations. She also goes back to CSIS. She was pretty much behind or encouraging of all the, worst Obama era foreign policy stuff. So when it comes to, Libya, Ukraine, Syria, everything bad, she was one of the loudest voices internally, apparently, pushing for this. Now, from what I've heard, she was sort of frozen out a little bit in the last year of the Obama administration. So I'm not sure, I don't know how she's going to appear back in this administration. And I'm also kind of thinking, were they sort of going for an optical woke kind of defense secretary? Because it seemed like basically their picks were between a woman and a black guy, and they ended up going for the black guy who was the Raytheon board member, as you already mentioned. So I don't know if that was what the decision-making process came down to, but it was sort of a big deal. A month and a half ago, it was sort of like, oh my God, it's going to be the first woman Secretary of Defense. How exciting this is. And you really couldn't make a worse pick besides her or Victoria Nuland, who I'm sure we're going to talk about a little bit.
In fact, let's talk about Victoria Nuland, because she also used to work at Center for New American Security, and now she was the ex-CEO, I believe. She's now an appointee in the State Department.
Yes, and she actually has a higher position in the State Department than she had before, which is pretty alarming. I mean, the position she has now is called Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. When she was in the Obama administration, she was started as a State Department spokesperson, kind of like in the same way Jen Psaki was at some point in the Obama administration. And then she eventually graduated to what ended up being one of the most key positions possible during that point in the Obama administration, which was Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasian Affairs. And I don't know exactly how it happened, but from my research, it appears that Obama and people who surrounded him sort of deferred a lot of this policy in terms of our engagement with the Ukraine situation to Victoria Nuland. And of course, for people who don't already know, she was infamously recorded on a leaked phone call discussing who she wanted to put in the new Ukrainian government before the current government had even fallen. And she was discussing this with Jeffrey Pyatt, who was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. And so a lot of people, rightfully so, have placed the blame on sort of the Ukraine coup on Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt. Now, there's definitely other people involved in that. Biden actually played a role in that as well. And, it's like, how did Hunter Biden get that gas gig? Well, probably, because of came out of this situation. So that's very troubling. And what I'm mostly worried about, Tina, is that Obama, for all his faults, actually did put some pushback against the sort of Victoria Nuland schema towards the end of his administration. I don't see Biden even remotely having the wherewithal to do anything like that. So that's sort of what we're up against, is I think that Biden is just going to be sort of just this robotic puppet in a lot of ways for some of the most vicious foreign policy things that didn't get a chance to fully materialize during the Obama era.
No, and I don't disagree with that. I feel like maybe we should have a little bit of a conversation about what neoconservative values are. Sure. And for folks that aren't clear on that, neoconservative, neoliberal, they stem from the same philosophical roots, right? So this is Hayek principles, a guy named Hayek, for the philosopher geeks out there. But basically the thing that they're arguing at base is that the market is the moral arbiter, right? The market, the free market is the moral arbiter. And almost all of their robust foreign policy is pretty much based on making the world safe for American business interests, right? For the free market. So when you have both parties embracing sort of a form of this, and really I think the only reason they started using these different terms, neoliberal, neoconservative, was to try to sell it to their bases. The same stuff, right? We're just going to brand it slightly differently, and that way the base won't understand the problem and maybe they'll be okay with it. But we're in a deep problem now because I feel, here we are, we're entering 2021, couldn't get that out. And it's as if Eisenhower was predicting this all those years ago when he said the military-industrial complex would be the biggest problem we faced in the future, that it would become something in and of itself that would not be controllable. And I think we're definitely there. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've been there as long as I've probably been alive.
Yeah, true.
I was born in the early 80s. So, I mean, ever since, every presidential administration has been largely dictated by these forces. But I think something interesting happened, during the Trump era. The last 4 years sort of, there was actually a lot of articles and op-eds sort of coming out before Trump got in saying that this was going to be the death of think tanks. And it was because their sort of position on that was that Trump was pulling away from our quote unquote international obligations, right?
More isolationist.
Sure, yeah. And there's a whole interesting framework that goes into that because, and then suddenly after that, we see Russiagate. We see all this paranoia about how Russia's meddling in our election, how they're going to, they're trying to divide us, and how we're just this weak country that can't stop all this Russian meddling, and we're just so vulnerable to it. That mindset, I think, was an artificial one, constructed largely, I think, not just by the national security state, but also these think tanks, sort of reset things in the sense that right before Trump, the mindset from all these think tanks was there was a consensus, and it was not just that we need to have the free markets dictate things and keep capital flowing. It was also we need to symbolically maintain America's sort of hegemonic standing in the world. Right. And make sure that America is still this bulwark for, evil, Hitler, the new Hitler. You hear Robert Kagan talk, one of the most influential of these think tankers, and he makes it all sound like America needs to be this big and scary and all over the world because there's going to be a new Hitler at some point. There's going to be a new crazy dictator that's going to try to take over the world, and America's and NATO and all our allies are the only ones that can stop it. Now that mindset, I think, got sort of reset. That was no longer a popular, they couldn't sell that belief as much to the American public, I guess what I'm saying. And so they sort of changed things around. And I think their mindset now is sort of like America's weak and we're losing. And we need to reassert our foreign policy dominance because if we don't, China and Russia are going to win. And that's a change from the way they talked 4 years ago. It was more like America's still really strong and we just need to prevent. Now it's more like a sort of a fear-mongering framework where it's like, no, they're going to take over.
In fact, I'm going to play a video right now because they just put out this sort of propaganda video called Winning the War, the Next War, which is the embodiment of what you are describing right now. So let's go ahead and play that. Winning the Next War video for Center for a New American Security, because this is frightful stuff.
The United States has been fighting a regional counterterrorist campaign for 18 years. As a result, its force structure is really focused on that problem. It has to completely change the way it thinks about warfare if it's going to go up against a great power competitor.
Absent a change in the way the United States fights its wars, we're at serious risk of losing a war to China or Russia in the future. If we actually want to compete with China and Russia long term and deter them from conducting a coercion or aggression against our allies and partners in the region, we're going to have to change the way that we fight, the way that we posture our forces, the way that we train them, organize them, and equip them in order to meet that challenge.
When the United States has a comfortable measure of conventional overmatch, planners on the other side have to look their political leaders in the eye and say, we're not certain we can actually beat the Americans. If you lose that overmatch, it just becomes more unpredictable. Another power might say, we want to use military force for our national interests, and we think we can do it. We don't even want them to get to, I think we can do it. We want them to stay at, no, we don't want to do it.
There are really 5 critical assumptions that we need to think about when it comes to future combat with China or Russia. The first is that the United States may no longer have a technological advantage against its adversary. The second is that we will not be fighting at a time and place of our choosing as we have in the past. The third is that we won't enjoy sanctuary outside the theater of combat, nor in the homeland. The fourth is that we will not have an advantage in accurate or timely information. The fifth assumption is that we'll not have the time and capability to establish dominance across all domains before initiating major combat operations. The critical issue is that if we don't change how we fight, it doesn't matter how much money we spend, we're still gonna be at risk of losing a war because we will have oriented ourselves on the wrong set of problems.
And the key American advantage is not necessarily always having the best technology, but being able to take that technology, develop operational concepts, train their forces, exercise their forces, and shift the way the force operates faster than any other military on the globe. That's our true advantage.
Oh, God, that's nauseating. So massive pro-war propaganda, let's make America stronger, we're too weak to fight. Just the embodiment of what you were just discussing. So I did want to play that. Also, I wanted to bring up one of these, so sometimes they publish these papers, right? But they're not really academic papers, even though they try to pretend that they are. But they had one called Incoming Hillary Administration that is pretty apropos as far as incoming Biden administration, especially given how many crossovers we've had between Obama, Hillary Clinton's, the Clintons both, and Biden. They're all sort of in that same group. What are your thoughts on that particular paper?
I think that it's probably the most clear paper or document that we have that will essentially predict what Biden's foreign policy is going to be.
Wow. Okay.
And I mean, that paper was published with, they published it in late 2015 with the assumption that Hillary was going to win.
Right.
So yeah, essentially, I mean, it's not just this think tank, but I think we need to look to any of the foreign policy endeavors that people under Obama weren't able to fully manifest. And it's specifically Syria and Ukraine. I think those are the 2 areas that we need to be the most concerned about, because people like Victoria Nuland and Michelle Flournoy, after they left the Obama administration, they actually went on frontline and kind of blamed him for killings in Syria and Ukraine. And, I thought that was quite unusual for them to do that. So that to me means that it's something that they are very passionate about. They're willing to, criticize Obama in terms of not killing enough people. They're blaming him for the loss of life for not sending more troops and more U.S. forces into those regions. So I think it's something they are very fixated on and that we're going to have to be very concerned about moving forward.
Yeah. Well, it's where all of that, you have the Venn diagram of where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party agree, and it's like a list of things that are scary for the American population. For the most part, this is the case because it's meant to serve corporate interests, right? So I want to shift gears now and talk about another one that I am very worried about, the Hudson Institute. Now, for some reason, this is a conservative think tank, but it's been used recently as sort of being pushed by some progressive forces, which I don't understand this at all. So in the past, they've got Nikki Haley, they've got James Baker III, Mike Pompeo just joined. These are all massive neoconservatives. So I have a Hudson Institute propaganda video I'm going to play for you, but I want to play a video of Mike Pompeo talking about Cuba because it sort of, for me, undergirds the entire conversation of where these guys are coming from.
But this story is not complete without acknowledging the central role Cuba and Russia have played and continue to play in undermining the democratic dreams of the Venezuelan people and their welfare. First, Cuba. No nation has done more to sustain the death and daily misery of ordinary Venezuelans, including Venezuela's military and their families, than the communists in Havana. Cuba is the true imperialist power in Venezuela.
No, bring everything up. So you should be laughing after watching that clip, because the idea that Cuba is the imperialist power is absolutely asinine. Cuba is barely able to function. How are they possibly an imperialist power? But they're so this is where, in my opinion, this is where you have all of the wealthy elites meeting together with corporate interests to try to preserve a status quo that keeps them in power and keeps them making more money. So it's the combination of that cycle of wealth increase, power increase, wealth increase, power increase, right? The reason you have most Cubans here that are conservatives, are on the right wing, is because they were the ones that lost out during the revolution, right? They were tied together with American business interests. They were wealthy. They were making money. They were exploiting the rest of the workers. So that argument is still happening, and it's just become so ingrained in American culture that nobody questions it inside our government at this point, which is just frightful to me. What are your thoughts on Mike Pompeo joining the Hudson Institute? Are you disturbed by that as well?
Very disturbed by it, and I'd say it's kind of exactly what, we should have been sort of worried about in terms of what the Hudson Institute was doing the whole time. And I say that meaning that, the Hudson Institute right now, or at least for most of the Trump era, has presented itself as some kind of right populist think tank, which is sort of interesting because, like I was saying, a lot of these more traditional think tanks sort of acted like their time was over, and they sort of needed to figure out a new way to advertise themselves. This think tank seems to have been very successful in figuring out a way to have prominence in the Trump era. And more than any other think tank in terms of the sort of the Trump-isms rhetoric that we're hearing, this think tank appears to have had more influence than any of the others. And it's interesting to me because they're also really linked into some of these weird fringe media outlets like Epoch Times or OAN or Newsmax. You'll see pretty much a revolving door of Hudson people on those channels. So there's some kind of network involving this sort of fringe area with Hudson. Mm-hmm. Scooter Libby is the vice chairman. He makes $300,000 a year there. I think actually after his pardon, he was allowed to do that. I don't know. Maybe he was doing that before the pardon. I'm not sure on that. Okay. But what's very fascinating about Hudson to me is that they've actually gained inroads into left activism. Yeah. Specifically the show Rising. Now, a lot of your listeners might be like, wait, that's a good show. What's wrong with that? Well, it's essentially the show Rising is a rebranded version of the Hudson Institute podcast called The Realignment, which is an interesting name in and of itself because what Hudson is doing is they're trying to force an artificial realignment by siphoning populist rhetoric, not just from the right, but also the left, and putting it together with essentially hawkish foreign policy or neocon kind of foreign policy. But the trick is they're really good at making it seem like they're against the ruling class. Mm-hmm. Now, when you look at their donors, it's all these pharmaceutical companies, all these corporations. And what's interesting is they're largely funded by some competing pharmaceutical companies to companies like Johnson & Johnson and some of these other companies. And they've been really big into the fentanyl China scare. Yeah. And I find that particularly interesting because some of the pharmaceutical companies that are funding them are benefiting from OxyContin and all these other opioids and trying to, so they're trying to make it seem like the worrisome part is this fentanyl that's coming in from China, not the big corporations who are getting everybody addicted to OxyContin and Fenatil patches, that you put on your arm from surgery. But the show Rising is really interesting because Sagar Anjeti, the guy who hosts it, he's really young. I don't know what his whole deal is, but he's made an incredible sort of presence for himself, in this sort of populist sphere. And a lot of leftists will still sort of promote his stuff. But when you go back and listen to the Realignment podcast, which is the template in which Rising is based off of, it's just a revolving door of neocons, straight up neocons, defense, think tank people, Trump officials. Pompeo's been on that podcast. So to me, that one is particularly fascinating. And I failed to mention that they are probably the most hawkish anti-China think tank of the moment.
Yes.
That's something that they've been really plugged into. It's, it's not just Epoch Times and all this stuff. It's even people like Matt Stoller, and you'll even hear other leftists even sometimes echoing their rhetoric. And it's like, my God, they must be very proud of themselves, because I've never seen a think tank manage to do that. That's a pretty impressive feat.
It is. They've made the Chinese Communist Party the boogeyman of so many things. And in fact, I was just filming a Trump thing, and they had a guy circling the outside of the protest in a car with a large microphone saying the CCP is the real enemy. So to me, this is more anti-worker rhetoric, right? Usually, in my experience, communist is a whistle for workers' rights. They try to conflate things together, because if you can scare people with this idea of authoritarian communism, then maybe people will care less about the fact that you're being exploited by the wealthy elites, and you're not going to have any kind of arguments or fights for workers' rights. And that's what this is really about. I think you're right on the populism part. So they're trying to do something where they're saying right populism, left populism. Let's get this together and convince these two audiences that our view of foreign policy is the correct one. But let me ask you this. There is a tension that exists there that I can't quite figure out. The tension is this. If you believe in populist policies, like if you look at Trump era populist policies, I'm not talking about Donald Trump per se, but his followers. The idea of America first, for example, these are very isolationist policies, right? Because they're talking about bringing this stuff back and using our resources at home. And I would say the same is true for the anti-war left. So how is it that you can hire and promote and talk about neoconservative principles and have neoconservatives as head of your think tank while claiming to be populists? These things are pretty close to mutually exclusive in my book.
Yeah, I mean, in theory they are, but I think we need to look back to the Reagan era for an example of how these concepts can be sort of disingenuously merged together. This concept of America first. During the Reagan era, it was sort of like, there was less focus on the international obligations and more of this unilateral approach to foreign policy.
Right.
And what happened, I think, so not to say that there isn't any value in the right populist sort of anti-war view. There's there's definitely some strong energy there. But what I think the danger with the right version of it is, because it's America first, it can easily flip and sort of morph into this idea that America knows best and America can essentially do whatever it wants.
Okay.
So there's this arrogance that is sort of the flip side of that. The arrogant, America can do whatever we want. No one can tell us any better. And so that's sort of how that, I think, can materialize from that right populist mindset. And I think you'll find even people who will be like, you'll find people who are in the Trump movement even now who will be like, I like Tulsi Gabbard. Yeah, I'm against anti-regime change wars, but we need to stop the Chi-Coms and the CCP. There are people who hold both of those views.
Right.
I think that's sort of, we're already in the realm where they've sort of, the America first has sort of metastasized into an almost like 80s old school evil empire, good versus evil.
Yeah.
And not to mention that QAnon, as a fringe movement even plays into that as well, because it's really emphasizing that good versus evil struggle.
No, that's absolutely right. So they've marinated their isolationism into American exceptionalism, which is what you're talking about, and because they're patriots, right? They see themselves as exceptional, and also the sort of incredibly racist anti-Semitic beliefs that are attached to that, being against so many things of that nature. So let's look at.
I just wanted to say, but yet they don't go after Israel.
No, they don't. And we're going to talk about that next. We are absolutely going to talk about that next. This is problematic for me. So let us play for 1 second their propaganda video that the Hudson Institute, it's pretty much a play on the same themes, but slightly different. But I think people need to be aware of this stuff. They need to see what they're putting out into the world and have an understanding of what we're working with here.
The Hudson Institute understands something that's very important. American leadership is indispensable to the advancement of freedom.
Hudson is an American think tank providing cutting-edge policy work on national security, economics, foreign policy, and on U.S. domestic policy.
I'm so proud of what Hudson continues to accomplish. Hudson's been at the forefront of policy development for decades.
I regularly rely on Hudson Institute scholars to help inform my thinking and the way I help shape policy here in the Senate.
Our analysis and recommendations have never been in greater demand by the U.S. government and by governments around the world. We help leaders and citizens better understand threats and how to meet them effectively.
For more than a half a century, this institute has dedicated itself to advancing global security, prosperity, and freedom. You've always advanced that vital truth, that American leadership lights the way.
We operate differently from most other think tanks in looking at the evolution of threats and beginning with the biggest challenges. Whether it be Japan, India, France, Germany, Americans and our allies want to better understand the dangers of the future and the options for reducing those dangers.
I want to thank the Hudson Institute, who is not testifying here today, but has been a very powerful force.
Across party lines, Democrats and Republicans, you're seeing this emerging consensus around a much more vigorous, aggressive posture towards China.
One of the things that gives us trust in Hudson's perspective is that it's not one singular perspective.
China poses a series of new challenges, and that the status quo was really not sustainable.
The policy of economic cooperation has simply given Communist China the resources to compete with the United States on a global scale, all while they continue to nationalize industries, steal from U.S. companies, deny basic human rights, violently suppress dissent, and pursue policies of religious oppression.
The global economic consequences of the coronavirus are probably deeper and more profound than we realize.
The Chinese Communist Party may be the single greatest challenge our nation has ever confronted and poses extraordinary challenges across the economic, the military, and the political domains.
We are dedicated to seeing what is different in the threats and opportunities of the future and how to make the trends bend to the security and prosperity of America and its allies.
It is time for all nations to join us in holding Iran to a new level of accountability for its destructive behavior.
And neither the Chinese nor the Russians share our commitment to freedom.
Hudson remains influential in American foreign policy and needed.
So, yeah, there we go. Okay, so that's the Hudson video. I think, so you see Tony Blinken's in there, Mike Pence, a whole host of characters from both parties are in this video, and they're, you know, unilaterally going after China, as you said, after the Communist Party, what have you. So what do you think, Robbie? How is this happening, and how are they selling this line beyond things like The Rising? They're getting into publications and other media sources too. How are they been able to infiltrate both sides so effectively? Because I think right now Hudson's the leader in that.
That's a very good question, and I wish I had the specific answers for you. But it is what we have seen, sort of a growing sentiment on the left and the right that China is this new problem. And I mean, not new problem, but it's becoming the biggest problem, and that it needs to be addressed. And I don't know how they've done it. But like I was mentioning earlier, Hudson Institute has some kind of ability to reach all these fringe media networks, including even conspiracy pushing media networks, which is a very new thing. And, you know, I studied Project for the New American Century, which has a place in sort of conspiracy culture, infamously. And so it's very interesting to see some of those same people now who come from Project for the New American Century actually plugging into the same conspiracy networks that they were acting like they were vehemently against during the Bush era. It's hard to make sense of. But one thing that's really interesting about Hudson is that they seem to have some connection to the Falun Gong and this Epoch Times network. And there is sort of a interesting relationship in Washington, D.C. with these far right cults. And, you know, Falun Gong is one. MEK is another really big one that's playing a role. Hudson Institute is tapped into both of those cults. So that gives them some, and I don't know if that, I mean, just to say that that's how they're doing what you described, I don't know if it is, but it's giving them an incredible amount of reach. I mean, You get the Epoch Times newspaper in your mailbox, and it's just 50% Hudson Institute talking points. I mean, I'm not even exaggerating.
No, exactly. You're right. What's interesting is like back at least 10, 15 years ago, the think tanks were looking like they would call it a win to get into political or what most people would consider more respectable publications. But you're right. They're all in these sort of fringe publications, and they're not ashamed of it. They're promoting it.
Yeah, it's very odd. I mean, what you saw during, especially in the last year or so of the Trump era, is you saw a lot of these fringe media networks, the ones that are characterized as conspiracy mongering, even some of them QAnon, adjacent channels, pushing Iranian and China regime change talking points from think tanks like the Hudson Institute, and also from, I don't know if you want to move there yet, but the Foundation for Defense of Democracies as well.
We can move there because I want to talk about Israel, and I would say they are the ones most involved with Israeli policy. Would you agree with that?
Yes. I mean, they wouldn't call it Israeli policy.
No, they'd call it Iranian policy.
Yeah, but yes, absolutely. They are the most deep in terms of their involvement in trying to move the needle on Iran. And by moving the needle, I mean away from any form of diplomacy or detente as much as possible. Right. They were also involved in that John Bolton super PAC that was trying to smear people even like Rand Paul and showing a family eating at the dinner table with a nuke going off in the background. This was in the last quarter or third of the Obama administration. So FDD is very aggressive about the issue of Iranian regime change. But what's the only really new thing about them recently is they've gotten into pushing a lot of Chinese regime change stuff. And they are one of the only think tanks that receives Israeli government money outright, as far as I know. There's probably others. And they also obviously receive defense contractor money. Trying to think of the main guy, Mark Dubowitz. And I want to say May are the two main there.
Mark Dubowitz, yeah.
And I would say they do a lot more managerial behind the scenes stuff than a think tank like Hudson, but they still have an enormous influence on things. And they do work with cults like the MEK, who have been known to work with the Mossad and CIA to do things like, industrial sabotage in Iran, assassinating nuclear scientists. We still don't really know which groups were involved in assassinating this new scientist. It's very likely that it was MEK related. Mm-hmm. And FDD and Hudson have this interesting, it's not just Falun Gong, MEK, they also plug into the Moonies, which is sort of this
I
Korean.
did not know that. That's interesting.
The Washington Times is essentially owned by the Moonies, which is pushing a lot of far-right conspiracy stuff. And also far-right Indian Hindu groups as well are connected to these organizations. And, the India equation of this is interesting because that plays into the China sort of, escalating things with China. Mm-hmm. We saw this flare up in the, the border between India and China and the Himalayas where, they actually there was a skirmish between troops where people died. So, a lot of people are saying, did Trump have something to do with that? Because there's been all this movement and energy coming from all these think tanks and sectors of DC to sort of inflate this Indian far right thing and sort of push it against China. Mm-hmm. So that's happening as well. There's a lot of different, angles to this. And of course, in that Hudson Institute clip you were playing, the talk about Japan and why they're such an important component to this now is as well because of China. And it also is a leveraging chip against North Korea because, they're sort of in the line of fire, so to speak. So that all that stuff sort of plays a role in this larger, geopolitical foreign policy agenda.
Indeed. So one of the things that Foundation for Defense of Democracy does that is kind of wild, in my opinion, is they run this thing called the National Security Alumni Network. You heard me right. And this is 100% funded by money from Israel. So you can enter this security program where they take you to Israel and you do a trip there, military trip, and you join this alumni group, and it's all national security professionals, right? So this is all like melded together. But Mark Dubowitz, who is the CEO, he talks anti-Iran talk all the time, like really tough anti-Iran talk. And I wanted to play a speech that he gave recently, and the reason I want to play it is because I just think this is appalling. So he's arguing against against releasing sanctions or giving any sort of sanctions relief, even now when the country is being ravaged by COVID. It's so inhumane, but he doesn't think that they deserve to have any sanctions relief. So let's go ahead and play this speech by Mark so people can hear what he thinks on that.
So for 41 years, the Iranian people have been suffering under a cruel and brutal regime. And now they face a severe health crisis as the coronavirus ravages the country. But the Iranian people know that this is the wrong time to give sanctions relief to this regime, a regime that only uses the billions of dollars that it gets in relief to fund its destructive activities abroad and its repression at home. The Iranian people also know that the supreme leader has tens of billions of dollars that he could use to deal with the coronavirus crisis and provide economic stimulus to the country. The supreme leader sits on about $200 billion in a corporate holding called ICO and a number of foundations that he controls. He has another $70 billion in oil money sitting in escrow accounts around the world. He has $20 billion in a sovereign wealth fund that he controls. He has over $300 billion that he can use to deal with this crisis. And yet the supreme leader knows that this is an opportunity to use this crisis to try and relieve the pressure. And in fact, Iran's president, Hassan Rouhani, even admitted that recently, that they're going to use this crisis to pressure the administration to relieve the sanctions that were put in place in order to address Iran's dangerous and destructive activities. The supreme leader does not need money. The supreme leader will use that money, as he has in the past, to fund Bashar Assad's slaughter in Syria, to send billions of dollars to Hezbollah for its terrorist activities, to fund Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza as they continue to send rockets into Israel, to fund Shiite militias in Iraq that are killing Americans and allied troops, and to support the Houthi terrorists in Yemen that are firing missiles at Saudi Arabia. The administration has not buckled to this pressure so far. The administration is holding firm and imposing successive rounds of sanctions to address Iran's malign activities and to keep the money out of the regime's coffers. This is the right policy approach, and the administration needs to double down on the pressure, even while it is figuring out ways to provide real medical support to the Iranians. The health ministry has admitted that they are getting all the health imports they need. Analysis by the Foundation for Defense of Democracies has shown that, in fact, pharmaceutical imports from Europe to Iran have actually not decreased over the past number of years. There are bank accounts available. There's money available. There's a Swiss humanitarian channel that's been set up by the U.S. Treasury Department that can facilitate humanitarian transactions, but also to ensure that the regime cannot use the humanitarian exception in U.S. sanctions laws to engage in the kind of massive sanctions busting, money laundering, terror financing, and proliferation-sensitive financing that it has in the past. The regime is notorious for using the humanitarian exception to facilitate billions of dollars in illicit transactions, and international banks know this. And in fact, the Financial Action Task Force, an international body that scrutinizes these activities, has recently reimposed countermeasures on Iran for its illicit activities. Iranian banks remain on SWIFT so that they can facilitate transactions through this humanitarian channel. And the United States has offered Iran repeatedly help to deal with the coronavirus crisis, help that the regime has rejected. So the supreme leader has hundreds of billions of dollars to deal with this crisis. He refuses to spend the money on his people and instead spend it on destructive activities. The U.S. government has done all it can to provide humanitarian exceptions to its laws and channels to facilitate humanitarian trade. And indeed, those channels seem to be working as medicine and other humanitarian goods are getting into Iran. It is not in the national security interest of the United States to lift sanctions. It is in the national security interest of the United States to use sanctions pressure to get the regime to stop its destructive activities, to end its nuclear weapons program and ballistic missile program, to stop supporting regional destruction and repression inside Iran. It is in the national security interest of the United States that the Iranians release the hostages that they've taken. It is in the interest of the national security of the United States that we use all instruments of American power in order to ensure that this regime no longer threatens Americans, no longer threatens its neighbors, and no longer represses its people.
Okay. Are we back? Okay, so let's unpack this speech a little bit. Obviously, he wants war with Iran. He's very robust argumentation for realist theory. You know, and everything amounts to national security issues for the United States. But here's the thing. Sanctions generally hurt poor people more than they hurt anybody else in a country, and they rarely have been effective in overturning any regime that the United States doesn't like. So at this point, for him to be arguing that is just cruel, in my opinion. I think there should be a humanitarian exemption for sanctions. But here he is saying there shouldn't be. What do you think about what Mark's arguing here?
Well, it's just disgusting to see someone like that, who has such nefarious motives, being the moral arbiter of what, if Iran is deserving of medical relief or not. I mean,
it's gross.
Serious. But yeah, he's a real scumbag. And, it's interesting actually hearing him talk now. I haven't watched a video of his in maybe over a year and a half. And, even the FDD, and this is something I think we need to be aware of, is some of these think tanks and people in them have actually realized to some extent that their rhetoric, some of their rhetoric in the past is unacceptable now in 2021. And I think what Mark Dubowitz has cleverly done is he makes it seem as if he doesn't want to preemptively strike Iran. Mm-hmm. When in reality, the people in FDD were the ones pushing that paradigm harder than almost anyone else and kind of got that idea to take float. So to hear him acting like it's just all about, punishing them from doing bad deeds, it's absolutely disingenuous. These people want to preemptively strike Iran. Mm-hmm. If Israel ever did something that crazy, they would be the first ones in line cheerleading them. That's their real agenda. And so even people like Crystal, used to want Iranian regime change. They used to talk about it. He doesn't talk about it anymore. So it'd be interesting to hook all these people up to a lie detector test and ask them, point blank, would you support a preemptive strike on Iran? I guarantee you most of them would show that they did in those lie detector test results. But I'd say 90% of them wouldn't admit it publicly. Like they won't admit it anymore. So that's kind of interesting. It's like they know that that's too much for the American public to find acceptable. They understand that on some level, so they're hiding that. Mm-hmm. But they still want it badly, very badly.
No, and you're not wrong. So FDD was birthed during the Bush years. That's where it got its teeth, so to speak. So they're also a registered lobbyist firm. So I think that needs to be pointed out as well. But coming to fruition during the George Bush years, that was the policy, preemptive war, right? We went to preemptive war with Iraq based on false pretenses, and there's no bones about it. We wanted to do the same thing in Iran, and by we, I mean as a country, not us per se. So that is where he is coming from. And I have to say personally, something that really bothers me about a lot of the arguments that they make in regards to Israel is that they make this conflation about the Jewish people with Israel, right? And oftentimes you have incredibly anti-Semitic groups that have inline policy desires with Israel. So they try to mask their anti-Semitism with being pro-Israel, right? That's sort of become a popular thing to do in this day and age. And I think it's a very dangerous thing to do. I mean, getting into bed like with your enemy, not smart. I think a prime example of this would be Yair Netanyahu, who is Netanyahu's son. He had this chummy relationship, so to speak, on Facebook with Richard Spencer, who is a neo-Nazi. But, they sort of got together over the same geopolitical desires. But this is a very dangerous game we're playing, in my opinion. So what are your thoughts there? Because I think any conversation we have about foreign policy in this area, this sort of needs to be discussed because it's not getting discussed and it's dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, we already went through a lot of discussion in the early 2000s about how every neocon was somehow secretly working on behalf of Israel or had dual loyalty. And I think that's sort of a gross overgeneralization that got some leftists and libertarians into a little bit of trouble because then it became sort of this thing as, well, is neocon, are you just saying neocon because it's code for Jew? So that
it became an anti-Semitic thing, and it's very upsetting.
It's a total trap. And I think that we need to look very specifically about this. It's not that these people are Jewish. I mean, James Woolsey, Seb Gorka, some of the people on FDD, some of the most hawkish people, I don't know if Michael Adine is Jewish or not, but James Woolsey, Gorka, these people are not Jewish, and they're extremely pro-Israel, and they're extremely hawkish. They want regime change in Iran. So this is not,
and not to interrupt you, but I would also say Gorka is absolutely anti-Semitic. He's a prime example of what I'm talking about.
Sure. Yeah, so it is very interesting to see these people dabbling into these, far right, anti-Semitic-esque worlds while also being involved in this think tank. It's kind of confounding in a way. It kind of reminds me of the Hudson Institute's style. But there's one other person I wanted to mention. I don't know if you read about this guy, but he's actually a fake. His name is Hashmat Ali. Have you heard of this guy before?
No, I don't think.
Essentially a fake creation of the MEK. He's a Twitter personality that went very viral. Trump retweeted him, and the FDD, promotes his stuff all the time. So he's literally a fake person that has a fake profile picture that is ran by a network of MEK people working out of an office in Albania.
Okay.
And this guy is all over the place. These think tankers love him, and it kind of reminds me of that deep fake pro-Israeli editorialist that was like running in newspapers a couple months ago, where people are like, "Oh, this guy's a deep fake. His picture's not even." So we're moving into a weird world here.
It is a very weird world, and it's something that I think that needs to be discussed more often because it's not discussed now. And look, there is a spectrum of thought that exists inside both Israel and also within the Jewish community, right? No group is monolithic in its beliefs, and it's really a mistake to conflate the word Zionism with Jewish. That needs to stop too, because again, there's arguments that happen internally in the community in regards to these things on the daily, right? You have a spectrum of political policies or parties in Israel that stem from ultra-nationalists, which is the home party, all the way to somebody on the progressive left side that want to work on Palestinian rights. But for some reason, all, and I mean all, of American foreign policy and all of the think tanks when it comes to this are very much centered on a very hard right viewpoint of what Israel is, what Israel wants. And I feel like they want geopolitical things their way, and they use this idea of like, if you're anti-Israel, you're anti-Semitic as a mask, when half of the time the people that are saying that truly are anti-Semitic. I hope this isn't confusing the audience at all, but I think this is something that needs to be discussed.
No, you're absolutely right. And what's interesting is there was an actual American Enterprise Institute event. It was sort of one of those panels. It had Bill Kristol in it and another guy named Francis Fukuyama, who
I know that guy.
Yeah, sort of like the end of history guy. They were both in the Project for the New American Century, and at one time they were very aligned. Now, what's interesting is during this panel talk, and I think it's a pretty genuine thing that Francis Fukuyama did, he directly criticizes Bill Kristol and his worldview because he doesn't say it's because Bill Kristol is Jewish or Zionist. He directly tells Bill Kristol that the neocons made the mistake of adopting the Likudnik view. And the Likud party in Israel, of course, is the most far-right, anti-Islam, racist
Actually,
party.
there are two parties more to the right of that. Be scared.
Okay. Well, then you'll have to tell me about that later. So I'm mostly familiar with the Likud party, but Francis Fukuyama is basically telling Bill Kristol, this is the views that you guys adopted, and you're inside the strategic prism of believing that Arabs only understand force. He literally tells this to Bill Kristol to his face.
Interesting.
And Bill Kristol is obviously very offended. He doesn't really know how to respond to it, but that's really what it is. It's like if your strategic prism and your these American think tanks really hold that belief, then they're essentially like racist and dehumanizing Muslims. I mean, that's sort of their fundamental view.
Yes, and the idea that all of Israel does that is really not correct at all, not even remotely correct. All right, so I thought that was worthy of conversation because I think Americans are fed on the daily a diet of hard right and right viewpoints when it comes to Middle Eastern policy, and they never hear from these other folks, right? So, something that needs to be discussed. So let's... who should we talk about next? There's so many terrible ones. I actually also want to have a conversation about private security firms. During the NSA Snowden event, we were exposed to what was really going on here. You have private security firms. You have our government meshed together with them. They are spying on Americans. They're spying on people all over the place, right? Palantir is one of the folks that I pay attention to. Law enforcement uses their software. The ICE detention centers use their software. It's a company owned by Peter Thiel, started by Peter Thiel, I should say. It's public now. Pegasus, here's another one. This is an Israeli company that does software. Their software was actually used to assassinate Jamal Khashoggi, and I think we need to talk about that. Pegasus is something that, if it enters your phone, whoever is on the receiving end of that can read everything in your phone, iPhones included, folks. So, and that's what they use. That's what the Saudi government used to track down Jamal, to assassinate him through some of the dissenters that he had been corresponding with. I think the story is that he got a DHL link in his messages for delivery, and he clicked on the link, and that was the end of that. We also have a situation where Facebook has hired police officers, right? This was happening in 2014. So we have sort of gotten used to all of these things related to private security, again, also related to foreign policy think tanks, because these things are all very much intertwined. And America seems to be losing more Fourth Amendment rights and not doing anything about it. And I don't understand where the uproar is. We should all be concerned, upset, and angry about this. But what do you think on that, Robbie?
Well, I think you raise an interesting point. I don't know if you meant to, but the idea that why aren't more Americans outraged about this? And I think there's been sort of a deliberate power transfer to the private sector on a lot of these things that could normally be, technically could be held to account. The public could have some method or means to hold the government to account. There's more of a process for that, even though we know a lot of this stuff is opaque and hidden and, kept secret, but still having all these things in the private sector makes it that much more opaque. And there's really no way the public can address it rather than just, I guess, boycotting purchasing power. But most of these are business to business companies. So what do you really do to fight it? You just got to make a lot of noise about it. But Thiel is someone really interesting. And I don't know how much involvement he still has in Palantir, but I mean, he's really involved seemingly in like this intellectual dark web sort of, populism stuff too. So
100%.
So a lot of people have this impression that Silicon Valley is unanimously liberal. They're all pro-Biden. I mean, it's not really the case. Someone like Peter Thiel is really interesting to look into. I mean, Eric Weinstein, this guy who's all over, these sort of right baiting shows now is a top guy at Thiel Capital. Yeah. Peter Thiel also hired or invested money into Mencius Moldbug's startup company, another guy who had a big influence all over the alt-right. But just in general, I mean, I feel like this has been going on so long that I don't know what you could do to combat it at this point. I mean, even when I was studying the 2001 anthrax attacks, I learned, sort of to my shock, that bioweapons are being made by private companies in the United States. And so, but I think that this is all interesting to talk about, though, because it really does bring to mind all this scaremongering we're hearing now about China's surveillance, because it's like, all we hear about now is China's tracking technology. They're face scanning. We saw this Intercept article about all the Uyghurs that they've been tracking. But in the end, it's like, I think we need to be talking more about what's happening here in this country. And,
definitely.
Not so much about China's surveillance technology, because this is all, I mean, this is happening like internationally. All these companies you mentioned, they have international operations as well. They're not just doing things here. So it's very disturbing. And, even Palantir, I think, is even getting involved in like 911 phone networks. Like they were talking about taking over that system. And it's just, no, that's not good.
No, it's bad. It's very bad. We don't need to privatize any more of these public goods, especially when they become for profit, right? We really want our 911 calls to be for profit. We didn't learn from the prison system. It's crazy, right? So let's talk about Alliance for Securing Democracy. This is Laura Rosenberger's organization. She's also, shockingly, ex-Obama, another Obama alumnus in this. What do you know about them?
Well, their whole approach is very different from what we've been talking about. They're the first think tank operation that got very involved in this idea of combating online disinformation. And of course, this started with the idea of Russian disinformation taking over our country, fake news. And now it's sort of QAnon and far right conspiracies that is the big danger that they're saying. But this think tank, when it started, this is going to sound weird to people, but it has serious people like Mike Morrell, Bill Kristol, Michael Chertoff from the Bush era.
Another neocon, yeah.
And so all these people are in this think tank, and they base all of their information off of what they say are around 800 Russian bots. And so their whole think tank for years was directly based off of a secret network of what they had identified as 800 Russian bots. And they were actually getting stories in the mainstream news media about this secret pool of 800 Russian bots they were tracking to discover what Russia was putting out into our, information sphere. Now that sounds ridiculous to most people listening, because it's like, well, they didn't disclose what those 800 accounts were. We're just supposed to trust them. Yes, we were just supposed to trust that they knew what these 800 accounts were, and that they were clearly coming from the Russian government. It sounds absurd, but for years and years and years, this think tank was constantly pushing this angle. And I think, because of their existence, they got this Russian troll factory thing to really break big, as if that was like one of the most scary, forms of meddling in our country. But Alliance Securing Democracy fits in with a sort of a new realm of DC think tanks that include the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Lab, which is an arm of the already existing think tank, the Atlantic Council, which is in the racket now of combating far-right disinformation. Now,
don't they run Facebook's fact-checking?
Yeah, which is super strange. They're on Facebook's fact-checking board. Now, Atlantic Council, by any measure, could be considered a far-right foreign policy think tank. So for them now to sort of act like and masquerade around as if they are a far-right watcher is just kind of ridiculous. And, so that's the part that, I think it's very insidious, because then we even have like Bellingcat, who are gaining all this prominence in not just the neoliberal sphere, but actually like leftists who are legitimately wanting to watch the far right, like leftists who want to watch neo-Nazi groups or Proud Boys militant groups. These groups like Alliance for Securing Democracy, Atlantic Council Digital Forensics Lab, and Bellingcat have made all these inroads into that sphere of the actual left. And that's, I think, very dangerous. So it's not just Hudson Institute that's plugged into like this idea of populism. It's these disinformation watching think tanks like Alliance for Securing Democracy that have gained a lot of credibility, even among like people who will self-identify as actual leftists. And that's very dangerous.
So, of course, what comes to mind as you're discussing this is H.B. Gary and the leaks that came out in 2011 from that are now on WikiLeaks, but originally they were on Barrett Brown's site. But, you had guys that were pre-Palantir. It's the same players that continued on. But what they were doing back in 2011 was creating persona management, creating troll farms, right? So they would have one actor. He would be responsible for 100 accounts. They would create a Twitter personality, a Facebook personality, sometimes even blogs, like actual blogs. So the idea was to make these fake persona management characters seem real. And corporations could hire them, the government could hire them to push narratives, right? To astroturf, social media, so to speak. And they went after, I think the most famous person they went after was Glenn Greenwald. Remember when they targeted him? They were also targeting union leaders. So these were corporations that were paying into this, not just the government. And, all these years later, a decade later, it's just become more robust. And I feel that everybody is in on this game. Everybody's astroturfing. I think all foreign entities, including the United States, if you're coming from the other sphere, we're all astroturfing, right? We're all trying to push a certain agenda and make it seem like that agenda is popular with the population. So this is a problem, and I'm not sure how it gets dealt with, because I don't think Twitter, Facebook, I don't know. I mean, how do you deal with these troll farms? How do you sort of flush them out and only have real people on there? I mean, it's a problem.
You essentially can't. I mean, that's sort of like creates this opening where anybody, like you said, can be astroturfing and running these sort of, I don't know what you call them, sock puppet bots or fake accounts to promote an agenda. Corporations could do it. So I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that there's become this new mentality in the DC think tank class and national security class where it seems valuable for them to present this woe is me, America's vulnerable to disinformation. We're being attacked on all sides. We're vulnerable, because then it creates this ability to be like, well, we need to crack down now on disinformation. But you like you said, there's barely any news coverage about domestic plot.
And it's robust, let's be honest.
Robust. So that's the thing, is how robust is that compared to this so-called specter of Russian disinformation or Iranian disinformation or whatever they're calling it? It's probably a drop in the bucket compared to that. And that's what we need to be worried about. And I also think that a lot of this is designed to distract away from that as well, because it's clearly happening. And largely there's nothing we could do about it unless we know exactly who's doing it and where it's coming from. Yeah, it's a really big problem.
It's a huge problem. So let's see, who have we missed on our list? I think that's everybody that I had wanted to ask you about. Did you have some other think tanks that you have on your radar that you're concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just briefly mention that Brookings and the
Brookings, yes, of course.
Atlantic Council will be putting their thumb on the scale to try to get the Biden administration to do more against Russia and to do more in Ukraine. That probably also includes Syria too, because that plays into the whole Russia thing. But the other one that's directly about war. So those think tanks I just mentioned, Atlantic Council and Brookings, are more about like the geostrategic chess pieces kind of approach. Institute for the Study of War is directly about war and what military maneuvers will work, what naval arrangements will work against China. And that think tank they're in Victoria Nuland's family. The people who run it, Fred and Kim Kagan. Kim Kagan is a sister-in-law of Victoria Nuland. Victoria Nuland is married to Robert Kagan. Robert Kagan's brother is Fred Kagan. Fred and Kim Kagan, this couple, married couple.
It's a giant Kagan neocon group.
What's sort of fascinating about them is they claim they did pro bono work for General Petraeus, advising him directly, sitting next to him every day in an office in Afghanistan, straight from this think tank. They didn't have an official role in the Pentagon. Obama gave the green light to this. And now David Petraeus is in their think tank, and he has this like huge role in it. It has Bill Kristol in it. And what's interesting is it's one of the only think tanks that's actually maintained full continuity across all the administrations since like the end of Bush. So there was someone in the Institute for the Study of War named General Jack Keane, who was advising the Pentagon continuously during Trump. And it was actually through his words on Fox News that I realized that all the stuff about Trump bringing home the troops from Afghanistan was all blowing smoke. Because General Jack Keane gets on there in Fox News. He's like, no, I'm talking to the Pentagon every day, and no, there's no plans to take any of the troops back. So I'm like, oh my God, the Institute for Study of War guy sort of told the truth. And he was telling the truth. So I think that's one we really need to look at. Even though they don't do very much PR, they're not really on the news that much. This Institute for the Study of War is going to have a very big impact on the Biden administration. And we're going to see people in the Pentagon, I think, immediately. Maybe even Petraeus will be back in as an advisor. I don't know.
It could happen. I think another thing to mention is a lot of these think tanks also have programming on C-SPAN. If you turn on C-SPAN any day of the week, you'll see a lot of these, organizations sponsoring talks. And they're basically just putting out their stuff. All right, so I wanted to turn to our chat for a second and see if we have any questions for Robbie from the audience. So if anybody has questions for Robbie, please go ahead and type them in, and we'll get them. All right, Australian Strategic Policy Institute is a horror story. Re China. Are you familiar with that one? Australian Strategic Policy Institute.
Australian Strategic Policy Institute?
Yeah, that's a new one on me.
No, I haven't heard of it, but if it's about China, that's interesting to me because Sky News and a lot of Australian politicians have been really amping up the rhetoric against China recently, and I think there's definitely something to that I need to explore deeper.
Okay, yeah, I've not heard of them. Sorry we couldn't answer that question for you. Does anybody have any questions for Robbie? Somebody must have some question. Or were we just so thorough in our discussion that... Come on, guys. Does any political party push dental added to your national health care? That's an odd question for a foreign policy. That might have been to somebody else earlier. Oh, she's talking to somebody else. Sorry. I'm like, don't know. They're talking about dental treatments. All right. I guess there's no deep questions there. So let me ask you this. What are your parting words, Robbie? Like, here we discussed 7 or 8 different think tanks. We've discussed how the think tanks are more or less lobbyist organizations, that they're actually doing academic work. They are getting paid by the military-industrial complex. They're getting paid by other corporations to put out pieces, to put out propaganda, to influence policy inside the government. So what are your parting words on this entire conversation that people should leave this conversation thinking about?
Well, I think we need to be very, very focused on the think tanks, especially during the Biden era, because a lot of his foreign policy will be dictated by the papers they're putting out, the policies they're putting out now, and be under no illusions that the think tanks are dead, or that Trump's administration somehow killed, the spirit of this DC foreign policy blob. They're still just as alive as ever, and they're going to try to make as much movements as they can, especially early. This is what these think tanks always do. They always try to push the hardest when an administration first gets in, because that's when it's the softest. That's when it's the most malleable. Towards the end of an administration, there's definitely been some aspect, like of the Obama administration pulling away from certain think tank spheres. But in general, this is the time when we need to be watching the most, is because they're going to be throwing the most policies out, trying to move the needle the most. And I think we're already seeing signs that the Biden administration is telegraphing that they're not going to get back into the JCPOA. They're going to actually, they're warning about Iran's nukes right now. They've already put out stuff about that. So that's a very bad sign. And I hope to God that FDD doesn't have a line into the Biden administration, but I can't say that they don't. I mean, geez, maybe they already do.
Maybe they already do. So somebody does want to know about your documentary. You're working on a documentary, Robbie?
Yes, I did. I think they're asking probably about A Very Heavy Agenda, which is a 3-part documentary series I made about 3 years ago. That's all about a specific group of think tankers that came from the Project for the New American Century, which is Bill Kristol and Kagan mostly. And it shows how they went, what did they do after the Bush era? Were the neocons gone? So my movie tries to track the trajectory of them, what they did in the Obama era, and how essentially they were at the tip of the spear of the Russia hostilities. And it's my movie sort of shows how the neocons pushed on the Russia stuff until they got the Democrats to adopt it. So now a lot of people think, well, it's the Dems who are pushing the Russia stuff. Well, in reality, it was the neocons who once again sort of got, were just super aggressive and continuing to lobby these talking points, and got that position to be adopted at a certain point.
Which is all true. It's absolutely true. This was, for a long time, that was the right that was pushing all that Russia hysteria. It was McCarthyism, right? And then here we are. You've got both sides doing it now. Anyway, thank you for coming on today, Robbie. I think this was a very informative conversation for the audience, because a lot of these think tanks kind of fly under the radar, but they're incredibly influential when it comes to our government. So thanks for joining me and having this discussion and illuminating this.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
100%. And if people want to follow you on Twitter, what is your Twitter handle?
They can follow me at Fluorescent Gray.
All right.